Good evening. If you will be turning to 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, and we will be picking up in our study in the Kings, 1 Kings chapter 3. And the section that we're looking at, the major heading during Solomon's reign, the section that we're looking at right now is wisdom and understanding. Wait, excuse me. We'll go one more. Humble request. There we go. Humble request, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Now, the last time that we were together, we were able to read these first three verses, and we're going to go ahead and read them again. And when we read them, I asked the question, what problems do we see within this text? And I asked it for a specific reason, because when I studied through this text here recently, I started asking a little bit of questions of myself and some of the things I previously believed when I would skim through this text. So I'm going to ask those same questions again today, but I hope as we work through this, you'll understand why. But let's go ahead and read chapter 3, verses 1 through 3 again, and then we'll get started. The text reads, "Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and a wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built in the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places." Now, y'all all may have already recognized this when you went through the text. Maybe I'm just behind in the game here. I don't know. When I read through this, typically when I look at this section of the text, one of the first things that comes to my mind is this relationship that Solomon has with Pharaoh's daughter. And my mind always goes to the thought, okay, well, this is wrong in him taking this Egyptian wife, right? That's one of the first thoughts that always hits our minds. And then I look at it and I say, okay, well, there's also this treaty or this alliance that is made between Solomon and Pharaoh. And I question that typically when I come through this. But then the more I read it, the more I thought about it. When I get down to verse 3, and what is stated in verse 3, "And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except." Now, if I'm reading that right, what is prior to that statement, it doesn't seem like it's really condemning it very much. It seems like when you get to the except, that's when here's this problem that Solomon has at this moment. So that really started making me think, okay, well, have I been misthinking this every time that I've gone through this text? Have I been not reasoning through the text properly? Well, I'm still trying to, nail down, and I don't know if I'll say, I'm dogmatic on either stance at the moment. But it definitely made me start questioning, okay, well, the things that I've always come through this text, and I always thought immediately, maybe I'm thinking wrong. Now, as it pertained to these relationships with these foreign people, who was it that was told you are not to marry of these foreign nations? People of Israel. When was this told to them?
Coming out of Egypt.
Coming out of Egypt. And where were they going? To the promised land. And they were told not to take for yourself wives of this land which you are going to inherit. Was Egypt any part of that land? It's not.
But he did recommend that they didn't ally themselves with Egypt.
We're going to look at some verses where there's a reference in Deuteronomy to not having any kind of trade with horses and things of that nature. And it looks like even at the end of that part of the text where it recognizes, okay, don't allow your people to trade with Egypt to gather up for yourself horses. Do not allow the people to go back that way. Do not allow them to go back to Egypt. And there's another one in Deuteronomy that mentions not allowing the people to go back to Egypt. You're not to go back that direction. So I question, okay, well, is it wrong for him to have this alliance when it seems like what is stated in the text is he did this, the people were offering sacrifices at the high places. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father, David, except. It seems like where Solomon is making the mistake, and what the text is trying to tell us, the mistake that's being made here, is he is also offering up sacrifices at the high places. But I haven't found anywhere in the text that it actually condemns his relationship with this daughter of Pharaoh. As a matter of fact, in chapter 11, it makes mention of he loved many women, and it mentions all these from these other nations. It recognizes his relationship that he has with Pharaoh's daughter, and then it says these other women of these other nations. And then it begins to list the same nations that we see within Deuteronomy that he says you are not to take for yourself these wives. So I'm not certain 100%, but I don't know if I can dogmatically say that it is a sinful relationship that he has with Pharaoh's daughter. Let's look at some verses and just kind of see what the text actually says. Let's go back to Exodus. Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34, verses 11 through 16. Exodus 34, 11 through 16. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Take heed to yourselves, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. For you shall worship no other God, for your God, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. And they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifices to their gods. And one of them invites you, and you eat of his sacrifices. And you take his daughters for your sons, and his daughter play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. Now, there's a recognition twice in this about not making a covenant with the people of this land. Again, even in this text, it's pointing to not making a covenant with the people of the land which you are going to inhabit. Pointing to the land of Canaan, the promised land, right? You're not to make any kind of covenant with these people. Do not allow your sons or your daughters to have any kind of relationships with these people, because ultimately what's going to take place if you do is we're going to run into a problem of idolatry. That's the warning that's given within this text. All right, look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. When the Lord your God bring you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. Again, there's a recognition of no kind of covenant with these people in the land that you are going to inherit. There's a recognition that you are not to allow your sons or your daughters to have relationships with the people of the land that you are going to inherit. Now, it's not directly stated in any of these that it is against the law for them to have an Egyptian wife. I only question that because I was reading through it and I saw the except in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 1, and I see how the text is speaking good things of Solomon, and then you get to verse 3 and it throws in the except, and the problem was he was offering up sacrifices at the high place. So I don't know. I'm kind of reasoning through the text myself. I don't think it's wise. I don't think it's wise by any means. Ultimately, it's going to be Solomon's downfall. He's going to take for himself many wives from these other nations, the specific nations even God had said not to, and it's going to lead him away into idolatry. But can I dogmatically say this relationship that he was in was a sinful relationship? Hard to say it was. Still hard to say it wasn't. It's kind of one of those difficult spots in the text. The only reason I bring all that up is because sometimes when we go through the text and we already have these thoughts in our mind, and this is what we've heard time and time again, here it is. That's what we're taking. That's our answer, without going through and actually studying verse by verse to see what all implies to this text. Yes, ma'am.
Was Moses' wife an Egyptian?
Moses' wife was it not an Ethiopian? Ethiopian. So it wasn't uncommon for leaders of God's people to have wives of foreign nations. And even, there was the instance where, was it Aaron and his wife came up against Moses and kind of tried to get on him about this, and the Lord struck her with leprosy.
Aaron and
Yeah.
Miriam.
Oh, his sister. That's right. Mm-hmm.
So you gotta remember they spent 300 years in Egypt, and they went in not so many, and they left in the millions.
Right.
So obviously they intermarried with the Egyptians while they were there.
I guess there's a possibility. They were even while they're in captivity. I would assume they would still somewhat be, secluded as the Hebrew people.
Yeah.
They were there with them for a long time.
The Hebrews lived in the land of Goshen, and that was separate from the Egyptians.
Right. And it's one of those. It's kind of like, well, we can say it's a possibility. We could assume it. Hard to say dogmatically. When I read through this, I've always had the similar train of thought when I go through this text, like, okay, well, that's wrong and this is wrong. And then I really got to look and I was like, wait a minute, it's not actually condemning Solomon until you get to verse 3. And it's more of this, he's worshiping at the high places. So that's when I began to question these other things. I see a hand go up over here. No? Okay. It's a difficult thing to, say dogmatically, is this something that was actually, wrong for Solomon? Well, look over at Deuteronomy chapter 21. This is another text that I considered as I was going through this, just thinking about what the law says in this situation. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. When you go out to war against your enemy, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives beautiful women, and desire her, and would take her for your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in your house, and mourn her father and her mother for a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall set her free, but you certainly shall not sell her for money. You shall not treat her brutally, because you have humbled her. So even within this going into the promised land, and you recognize this warning against allowing your sons and your daughters to have these relationships, but there is also this scenario where it's, well, if there are these ones that you desire, there's a certain process that's going to take place. You're going to make sure, in a sense, it seems like you're going to make sure that she completely withdraws from her previous lifestyle, from her previous beliefs, and accepts this new lifestyle of Israel, of God's people. And if that's the case, she has been humbled, and it's almost saying, in that sense, then this is okay. So there were already some things, in the law pertaining to that. Yes, sir.
We also have the example of Ruth, the Moabite, that they were fighting against. She does that process.
Right. Ruth is another good example. A Moabite is another good example that would fit right into this category, thinking about these things. I don't know, I just bring it up to challenge us sometimes when we're running through the text. Just because we've, always looked at this and we've immediately gone away with this conclusion, make sure that we're studying all the text. Make sure that we're truly, being studious and really examining what the Word says before we draw our conclusions, just because it's something that we've heard again and again. Yes, sir.
With Ruth, though, she was willing to become a Jew, a proselyted Jew. She told her mother-in-law, you know, your people will be my people.
Right.
In other words, I'm going to change.
And I think even what we see in Deuteronomy chapter 21 is implying that same kind of, thought process. If she's going to cut her nails, trim her hair, she's going to put off her clothes from her, her homeland, and she's essentially going to adapt this new lifestyle. It's very much like that, I think, is what is being seen here. So with all that said, is it possible that Solomon, in taking this wife, Pharaoh's daughter, she comes in and she actually then, somewhat in that sense, like proselytes into Israel, into that belief system? Just a thought. So the second thing that I questioned is having this tie with Egypt against the law. He has this treaty that he has formed, this alliance that he has formed with Egypt. Now, what has Egypt always represented? Captivity, bondage, even idolatry. It's always been something that's looked at in a negative sense. But again, it doesn't look like in 1 Kings chapter 3 that is necessarily condemned right off the bat. Well, let's look at what some of the law says. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 15 through 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 15 through 17. If somebody will, please read Deuteronomy 17, verses 15 through 17.
Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shall thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold.
All right, so you get the warning there in 17 about the multiplying for himself wives. You get to 1 Kings chapter 11, and that's kind of what Solomon has done. He's multiplied for himself wives from all these nations, and he's turned to idolatry. But also within that, there's this warning against the trading of horses and the multiplying up of horses. And do not allow your people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. You're not going back to Egypt. That's not where you need to go. Now, in Solomon taking for himself this Egyptian wife, if she comes into Israel and accepts that type of living and belief, that's not necessarily having anybody go back to Egypt. So is that actually any sin in this alliance that he has established with Egypt? Difficult questions. It doesn't seem like he's being condemned for anything at this point. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68. Now this is a warning at the latter part of Deuteronomy chapter 28. The beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 28 is actually focused on blessings for those who are obedient. And then the latter part of it is the curses of the disobedient. Basically, what's going to happen if you're disobedient to God's law. Well, Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68, it says, and the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again. And where you shall be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. This was a location you were never meant to go back to. Now, if you are disobedient, I think maybe within this context, the idea of Egypt is a thought of bondage and slavery. That's more of what's being recognized. He says, if you turn away from me, if you do not keep my law, you can expect to go back into bondage. But it's still stated, this is a place that you were never supposed to go back to. So the immediate response of coming into this text and saying, you know what, I think this is definitely a sinful alliance, this is a sinful relationship, I don't know if we can jump on that dogmatically. It's a little bit more of a study than that, a little bit more challenging to come up with a solid answer. Now, the latter part, back in our text, 1 Kings chapter 3, this has a lot to do with what's going on, I think, the second part of the verse 1. I think this has a lot to do with why some of these things are being said. It says, then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord. and the wall around Jerusalem. So he's still in the process of actually getting all of these building projects going. Well, at this point, when he brings back this Egyptian wife, she's staying there at the city of David, but as soon as her house is actually built, he's going to move her. And he's no longer going to have her staying right there in the city of David. Look over to 1 Kings chapter 7 and verse 8. 1 Kings 7 and verse 8, if somebody will, please read that. 1 Kings 7 and verse 8.
In the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like his hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife.
So he's making a specific house for his wife, Pharaoh's daughter. And then look at 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 11. It gives a little bit more insight as to why he actually builds her a separate house. 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 11, if somebody will please read that.
Solomon brought the daughter of Pharaoh up from the city of David to the house he had built for her. For he said, My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy.
But he recognizes at least this necessity of her staying outside of the city area, staying outside of Jerusalem. He does recognize a distinction there and builds a house so that she's not right there in that vicinity. But again, I haven't seen anything yet that says it's actually a sinful relationship. And it's one of those that's difficult. I don't know. I went through the text and I read through this and I got even to that part of verse 1 and I thought, okay, well, why is it actually saying anything about these places that haven't been built yet? Well, look at verse 2. It says, meanwhile, back in chapter 3, verse 2, meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. Well, the reason that they were offering sacrifices at the high places is because the temple wasn't built yet. The reason that Pharaoh's daughter was staying where she was staying was because her house was not built yet. So there are a lot of things that are kind of contingent upon on Solomon getting these things actually built and ready so that everything can be in its proper place. Well, when we commonly think about high places, what do we immediately think about? The high places? Idolatry, right? That's the common thought. Well, pretty much from this point forward, when you go into the rest of Kings and on even into 2 Kings, anytime that you see any mention about the high places, it is in the sense of idolatry. Well, this is the one exception that's found in verse 3 is Solomon, he loved the Lord, he was walking in the statutes of his father, except that he sacrificed at the high places. Okay, so why is it wrong that Solomon was sacrificing at this specific high place? And I asked the question last time, was it always wrong to offer at these high places? Well, let's look at a few verses. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. And this is very similar to one of the texts we've already read. But here was the responsibility or the expectation that they had as they went into the land. Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 through 5, it says, These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall be careful to observe in the land which the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, is giving you to possess. All the days that you live on the earth, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. And you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and burn their wooden images with fire. You shall cut down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name from that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things, but you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all of your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there you shall go. There's a distinction between the high places that these nations were actually using for their idolatrous practices. But there was also this place that God had chose for himself. This is where I want you to go and I want you to worship my name. All right, look at 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And Solomon spoke to all of Israel, to the captains of thousands, of hundreds, to the judges, and to every leader in all Israel, the heads of the fathers' houses. Then Solomon and all of the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon. For the tabernacle of meeting with God was there, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness. But David had brought up the ark of God from Kirjath-jearim to the place David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem. So this is the specific high place that Moses had actually set up the tabernacle in the past and where they offered many sacrifices. This is the high place at Gibeon. So they're going and they're offering up sacrifices there. Now, why would it be said that this is actually Solomon's one fault at this time? This is the exception. This is what Solomon was actually doing that was condemned in a sense, or at least spoken negative of. Think back to the end of 2 Samuel. Remember David in the threshing floor? Right? And he purchased that land. He purchased the land, and ultimately what David had done there was built an altar by instruction of the Lord. And he says, this is going to be the altar where we will burn sacrifices and offer up offerings to the Lord our God. That's ultimately where the temple would be built. So now the temple has not been built, what we see at the beginning of chapter 3 in 1 Kings. So the people are right now going up to the high place. They're worshiping there. They're offering up these sacrifices. And even Solomon's doing the same thing because the temple is not built in the location that God desired. It wasn't the same high places that all these foreign nations were worshiping and offering up sacrifices to their gods. It was a place where the tabernacle was. It was a place that God had chose in the past, but it wasn't where God wanted them to be at that time. He wanted the temple built. So Solomon in this instance is actually doing this, and God says, this is not something that I want you to be doing. It's pretty challenging going through that first part of 1 Kings chapter 3 and really reasoning through the text and asking questions of the text, but I think it helps us to better understand what's going on without just coming into it with, previous assumptions that we have about the text and automatically jumping on that and saying, well, this is what's going on. Well, and Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except for these sacrifices. The problem was he was still going to Gibeon to offer up these sacrifices rather than having the temple built where it was supposed to be built. Where was the ark? It was in Jerusalem, right? Remember, even in the tabernacle originally, you had the Ark of the Covenant. You also had the altar, and they were in separate rooms. You had the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would be. There's going to come a time when the temple's done that all those things are back together again in this strong structure, the temple, and all worship will be how God wanted it to be. So, the high places, we can't just immediately say, well, that's idolatrous worship, because this was actually a place that God had chose for them in the past. It just wasn't the place that God wanted them to be at this time. All right, if somebody will, read 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 4 and 5.
Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask, what shall I give you?
So, the location, Gibeon, the same that we saw in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. We did see also there that there were a whole lot of people that had gone with Solomon. There were a multitude of people that had gone with him to offer up these sacrifices, and what's believed is this was some sort of a festival in a sense, where lots and lots of people go and they offered up a great number of sacrifices to the Lord. And in this, that night, Solomon, while he's asleep and he's, dreaming or whatever, this dream comes to him and God asks, what shall I give you? Now, just to second the thought that we already discussed in all of the first part of chapter 3, if all those things were wrong, if all those things were sinful, would it immediately be followed by God giving Solomon this great blessing? That's not commonly how we see it work, right? If there's sin taking place, you don't typically see God giving blessings because of those things, but rather there's punishment. Well, immediately you find Solomon, after those things are stated, in a dream, God asks, "What shall I give you?" Now, in the history of Bible classes, since the beginning of Bible classes, it's probably been asked every single time you get to this part in the text, if you were asked, what would your response be? You know, it's something that we say, it's probably mentioned in every Bible class every time you get to this verse in the text, but do we ever take it to heart and really think about, if I had one thing and God was going to give it to me, I had one thing that I could ask of, what would it be? Would it be something that was focused on myself, to my own benefit? Would it be something possibly that was going to benefit others but also still benefited me? Or would it even be something that was going to benefit others, benefit God, and also benefit me? The reason I put it as the humble request is because this is a very humble request that we're going to see by Solomon. What he's going to ask of the Lord is something that's going to benefit God's people. It's something that's going to benefit God. And it's something that's also going to benefit Solomon. But he recognizes his lowly place in this situation. He sees the whole situation clearly and says, man, I don't know how I'm going to do this without your help, God. If you're going to give me one thing, please help me in knowing how to lead these people, your people. And he's the king. You see the humility? Even as the king of the people, he's the king of this great nation. But he's going to say, Lord, these are your people. They are so great. They are so numerous. They can't be counted. I need your help, God. That's humility. Let's go ahead and read verses 6 through 9. Verses 6 through 9, if somebody will. Verses 6 through 9.
Solomon said, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?"
Thank you, sir. Okay, when we were in preaching school in our chapel setting, we typically had something similar to this. We'd have a text, we would read through the text, and then we would have a question that was asked of us, and we had 5 minutes to come up with our answers. And then we would have Kevin give us his top 10 list. This was our daily routine there, and we always look forward to it. Okay, we're going to do something similar. I think it helps us to think through the text and think about the situation. In this section, in verses 6 through 9, what can we learn about Solomon in his response? What can we know about him by looking at his response to God?
Recognize God's authority.
He recognizes God's authority? Yeah, absolutely. He knows who's in control in this situation. He sees the authority of God and he respects that authority, it seems. What else?
He sees his own limitations.
Right? He definitely sees his own limitations, and he says of himself that he's like a little child. Now I don't think it necessarily means he's this little child who doesn't truly know how to go in or go out. He's recognizing in this grand scheme, in this great responsibility that's been put on his shoulders, he's like a little child in the sense that this is a great responsibility and he needs God's help in this, right? What else?
There's a sense of thankfulness.
Sense of thankfulness? Absolutely. You can see that in verse 6 and verse 7. Recognizing that it's God who has allowed even David to sit on the throne and he was blessed by God. And now he's even given Solomon the opportunity to be king over Israel. So there's a sense of thankfulness. What else?
Wisdom.
Wisdom?
or maturity.
Maturity? And I think either one could go in this scenario. Again, he mentioned himself like a little child, but man, this is an extremely mature response. Remember the question that was just asked. And even thinking about ourselves, what would we say? Man, I don't know if I would be able to come up with this, right? This is pretty impressive. Very, very much wisdom seen and maturity seen in it. Yes, sir.
Understanding of the responsibility before him.
Right? He sees the bigger picture, and he recognizes that he has great responsibility before him. Definitely sees that. What else?
He sees himself as a servant, not a king, really.
That's right. He sees himself as a servant. He sees himself as a servant. Even in the very end of this, if you look at verse 9, therefore give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people. He's recognizing who is in all authority here. It's your people. Give me wisdom to know how to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people? Right? This is the king. This is the king of God's people, and he's still saying, look, I need your help. I'm your servant. He's a lowly man, even at that. What else?
He's also a leader.
A leader, right? You see his leadership and great leadership at that. Given this question that's been presented to him, he could have easily asked for all kinds of things. But he wants to be even a better leader than what he already shows to be, right? Remember, this is God's chosen. This is God's anointed. This is one that was chosen by God, just the same as David was chosen by God. So he's already proved himself in some sense, but he still wants to be even a better leader than what he has already shown to be. Very good. Anything else?
A lot of love.
Huh?
A lot of love.
A lot of love. He definitely seems to have love for God. He has love for his father. He has love for the people. So there's definitely love that you see in Solomon. Many of what I've actually got down here, I went through this and I was looking at it, and I had 6 things listed down. I was like, man, this is just like our chapel stuff. So I went in there and me and Preston started talking, and we had our own little chapel discussion today, and we added 4 more to it. But here's what I had as far as things that we can learn about Solomon, and some of these y'all have already stated. Verse 6, he says, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth. He understands the nature of God. Solomon, even at this point in his life, he very much understands the nature of God and his attributes and how he's showing mercy and kindness even to David, and he understands that. But also he understands the value of righteousness. You see how he talks about David, and he says how David walked before you in truth and in righteousness and uprightness. He understands the value of righteousness and the way that David lived his life, and he was blessed greatly because of these things. He recognizes that. But he also understands who's in control. That's verses 6 and 7. I think that one was already stated just the same. He understands who's in control of this entire situation. God put David in to reign as king. God put Solomon in to reign as king. And he has blessed them abundantly. But he trusts in the promises of God. Verse 6. You see where it says in the latter part, he says, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now remember the Davidic promise all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel 12. Man, I missed that one by a mile. The Davidic promise, when it's stated that you shall have a son that's going to build the temple, right? You're going to have a son that's going to reign in your place. In that promise, there is a promise of the son, and it's almost as if Solomon recognizes that, and he's saying, look, just as you said you were going to give him a son to sit on his throne, you have done that, and he is now reigning, and that is Solomon, who is reigning this day. But also in verse 8, you recognize where he talks about the people who are so numerous that they cannot be counted or numbered? You remember what was said to Abraham in the Abrahamic promise? Your nation will be like the stars. Your descendants will be like the stars in the heavens, like the sands of the sea, a number that cannot be numbered. Sir? It was 7? Okay. 2 Samuel 7. So I did say it once, where I also said other stuff too.
Genesis 12 is where the stars come from.
Right, in Genesis, yeah. So, and then there's another reference that references the sands of the sea. So was it in this case that Solomon even had knowledge of those promises and is somewhat bringing that out in here? Possibly. So you could say that he trusts in the promises of God, but he recognizes his dependency on God, verses 7 and 8. This was also somewhat mentioned. He recognizes his position like, man, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I need you, God. There's no way that I can rule over these people and execute judgment and justice and all of these things if I do not have your help along the way. So he recognizes his dependency on God, but he also recognizes how great of a task is before him. I think that was also mentioned. That's in verse 8. And he recognizes that great authority demands great responsibility. I don't know how many times we've heard that in our lives. I know I've heard it more times than I could possibly count, but this is one of those scenarios where you see it. He knows with the authority that has been given to him, it brings about great responsibility. And because of recognizing that, I think part of that is why he asks God for what he asked for. He has a great challenge before him, and he says, look, I need your help. I need your help in understanding and knowing how to lead your people how you see fit. He knows he is incapable without God. I took that from verse 9. And he also recognizes the value of justice from verse 9. What was it that he wanted to be able to do? Be able to judge and to discern between good and evil. He recognizes the value of justice. One last one, he understands his position. He understands his position, and like Chris said, he's a servant. Yes, he's the king of the people. He's the king of the entire nation. But first and foremost, he says, I'm a servant of yours, God. He recognizes his position. That's just a way that you can go through the text. And I didn't actually mean to do that when I first went into it. But the more I started going through that text and asking questions about Solomon and his character, the more I come around to our chapel setting. And then I said, hey, man, we got to go ahead and just put this in our class tonight. So it's a good way to study the text and look at different parts of the text and ask questions of the text. And you can really think about a lot more as it pertains even to Solomon in this situation. You can learn a lot about him that in just a surface reading, you may not pick up. That's probably all the time we're going to have. I think the bell's going to ring here any minute. So I appreciate your attention. That got us through 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 9. We will start next week at 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 10, and we're going to see God's response to Solomon's humble request.